Right. Thank you, Timo, for your kind words. You make me blush. So dear President, dear colleagues, dear friends and family, it's indeed a privilege to be standing up here and to be part of the Aalto community. So for me, as Timo was describing, so it's partially I have the sense of coming back home, but also I'm really enthusiastic about what Aalto as a university stands for, and really see a lot of potential in its various schools. So I'm really happy to be here. And I'm especially happy because I get this, my moment in the spotlight now, and I'll try to be relatively brief, by the way, and also try to be as, well, I try to avoid jargon. I'll try to be as explicit and common, use terms that we all can understand as possible. Well, in any case, so I'll be having an opportunity to say something about my research on strategic decision making, the kind of stuff that I'm doing with my colleagues at the Department of Management, our school, at our School of Business, and I'll focus on the role of communication and language, or discourse, as the heading says. So decision making is, of course, something that has been studied for a long time, hundreds of years by philosophers, historians, political scientists, psychologists, military strategists, etc., including then also economists and finance scholars, as well as us organization scholars or strategy researchers. And the way I like to approach this is that unlike my economist or finance friends, I think it's important to not only look at the rational aspects of decision making or construct models of such decision making, but try to place this strategic decision making in its social and societal context. So that's why the focus that I like to have is on the social processes and practices in and through which decisions are made. So decisions in organizations, and of course, most of the things that we live with are organizations, smaller or bigger ones. I'm primarily here talking about companies, but I think it's important to understand that there are all kinds of organizations in our world. And I think that this kind of focus is useful, and this, I guess, goes very well with the Aalto spirit in terms of us here as scholars or as students working with or being part of companies. But also what I want to emphasize here is that to really understand what's going on, we have to take the social context seriously, which means that we as scholars should also draw from social sciences and even the humanities to understand the social aspects of strategic decision making. And I think this is cool and interesting because the world is also changing. So this is actually a slide from a course that I'm teaching at this moment with my good colleague and friend Janne Tenured on strategic change. And somewhat simplistically, what we try to say with this figure is that not so long ago, now talking about companies and corporations, when we think about strategic decision making, it was very much top management-led activity, which was very secretive, perhaps even mystical to others. So the role of others who were not participating in special sessions, for example, in this picture, this is one of those Kelohonka mökkis, log cabins, which in a way symbolize some of the decision-making practices, which may have worked in some ways, but maybe not in others. Well, we have moved on from those times such that now when we think about organizations and what's happening in corporations, people expect to be involved, as Tuula was, by the way, describing about Aalto's strategy process, and they seek information, and also organizations, especially companies, have realized that people need to be involved in addition to the top management elite, because other people have great ideas also, and then it's up to the people to really then enact or implement the great strategic ideas of top management. So hence the second picture. But our world is changing more, and I think that what the real question or mystery at this point is to try to understand first what's happening with organizations, and then what's happening with the strategic decision making. And I think we are indeed facing a fundamental change, and I'll only put 3 points on the slide. There are other points as well. But one of the starting points here, I think, must be that to understand like contemporary organizations in terms of new companies, for example, those are not the likes of big paper mills or industrial corporations that we usually think about in terms of depicting organizations or what happens in them in terms of their management or strategic decision making. It's more and more so that the new companies are actually quite small companies, but they are increasingly networked. And the older companies or organizations are also increasingly changing, and actually much of the key decision-making processes, they are taking place not only by the core or the top management teams, for example, but it's also happening at the outskirts or at the periphery or at the boundaries. And I think this is important. It's practically important, but it's also actually theoretically interesting in terms of our theories of organizations and strategic decision making. And with this, we also have the phenomenon that there are actually less and less people who are doing these operational activities. So our image of an organization as a hierarchy or pyramid is kind of no longer valid. And also for the reasons that I just mentioned, in the sense that people want to be informed, people want to be asked to be involved, they also need to be engaged to realize these strategic ideas. There's a bigger need than ever to really communicate. It's through communication and language really also that the very ideas that we may call strategies or the beginnings of strategies are, crystallized, shared, spread, and finally perhaps enacted. So hence the focus on discourse or language and communication as an increasingly important part of strategic decision making. It's always been that, but it's increasingly important. And this relates to the third point as well. And this, it's actually a little bit difficult to build bridges to the previous presentations because we are dealing with fundamentally different kinds of sciences. So I'm a social scientist here, as you can hear. But you were talking about silicon, so that reminds me of the gadgets that we have, and like you were saying, in our pockets, or maybe someone is bored with this talk and mainly doing other things with the gadgets. So what I'm saying is that actually we're living in a mediatized society, even a global society, and what is done in organizations, what we do in our personal lives, and what is also the characteristic of decision-making, strategic decision-making more and more, is that it's indeed mediatized. And by media, I don't simply mean that it's important what Helsingin Sanomat says or what's in The Economist or what we have in our Twitter accounts, but it's much more. It's both the communication that spreads, but it's also the practices and the technologies with which we do this. And I think these are really important things, fundamentally affecting the way in which strategic decision-making actually happens in organizations. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to unravel and better understand. So how can this be done, and what kinds of topics might this include? One term that I think is useful here is to talk about discursive strategizing. So not like strategic planning as it oftentimes is conceptualized, but activity of continuous decision-making and strategic decision-making in these different arenas. And to be clear and to simplify a little bit, I'm here making the distinction of two arenas. So first of all, like the internal arenas of organizations or companies. And this is closer to the kinds of studies that we usually have in strategic management or in decision-making sciences. But there's also the other arena, which is the external arena. And I'll just say a couple of words about the kinds of things that I think are interesting and indeed what we are studying at this moment. So organizational strategy making. So as Tuula was describing, Aalto is working on its strategy. Also picked up the example of Espoo because we are indeed in Espoo. And actually we also have a nice project with the top management of ESPO that focuses on their strategy processes, which is actually quite interesting because it involves a narrative. So they talk about the ESPO story, and they use that in various ways in their internal and external decision-making processes. So that's one part, and this is a really important part because actually, as we just heard, universities have strategies, but this goes further. Even kindergartens have strategies nowadays. So this is a phenomenon in its own right that deserves attention, and it's very much, around texts, communication, plans, etc. So it's very much about language or discourse. But perhaps the bottom part in terms of making sense of strategic issues, initiatives, and ideas is even more important because this is the actual decision-making or discursive strategizing that goes on, meaning that, in the turmoil and constant change of in various sectors, in companies or other organizations, there are a lot of different kinds of ideas that are being proposed, debated, discussed, negotiated, and perhaps then enacted in one form or another. So what are these things? To simplify, those are the kinds of things that I think really matter, like what companies make in terms of investment decisions, or including things like mergers and acquisitions that, as we have been studying, or decisions to shut down operations, or to do plant closures, do reductions in personnel, etc. So important organizational changes, which oftentimes also, especially in bigger organizations, have impacts beyond the boundaries of the organization. So it's important to study those processes. And again, I would say that a really important part, not so well understood as of yet, are the discursive and rhetorical struggles and strategies that are involved. But that's not the whole story for contemporary organizations, not to speak of future organizations. So hence the external arenas. So again, I'll try to have some fairly clear examples in mind. So it's not only like, what any organization or corporation, such as the iconic example of Nokia does, but it's also a question of how others relate to this doing or these strategic choices. So it's extremely important. And it's how, for example, the investor community perceives the new strategic decisions by Nokia's top management, which has a huge impact, of course, via stock price development and other means in terms of what's actually going on or what could be proposed as potential strategies. Equally, at times, Nokia or any other corporation may be, for example, in the media's headlines in terms of being a responsible or non-responsible employer or corporation. But it's also the case that with specific issues or initiatives or ideas, we have the media come in. And I'll simplify again by mainly thinking about let's think about the mass media for a moment. So, and this arena is also very reactive in the sense that companies may have, let's say, important merger or acquisition processes going on. But the way they go might be hugely impacted by the reactions in the media, and not only, of course, in the mass media. And in many ways, the actual strategizing and the key aspects of strategic decision-making in cases such as Talvivaara, there's actually a movie about that, which I haven't seen, but I tend to see. But I'm saying that we shouldn't only, let the filmmakers do the research, but we should be doing this research on cases such as Talvivaara or Fennovoima, which are important cases. They're not only important for what's happening in those companies, but it's also more broadly important for various stakeholders and the society as to what happens. But the actual decision-making processes, the strategic decision-making processes in cases such as those, or for example in Nokia's merger with Alcatel-Lucent that we intend to study, it's really the media that also has a huge impact on what's going on, to the extent that media at times it's not so much an arena, but it may also be an actor in these processes. Okay, so I think those kinds of things deserve our attention and should be studied in detail by various kinds of methods and means. So what's the role of language in this? Well, I'm the first person to say that we can study these processes or cases by various kinds of methods. So for example, I'm a big fan of historical case study method. So we have actually a very nice, cool project with a colleague of mine, Juha Antti in Jyväskylä, who's a historian and strategy scholar. So we are looking at strategic decision-making in Cold War Finland. So we're looking at the Finnish-Soviet trade and the strategic practices and processes of decision-making around our former president Urho Kekkonen. So cool things like, Kekkonen's sauna or, drinking vodka and other things, which might actually strike as anecdotes, but they're not. They were really an important part of the processes and practices if we have an open mind and really try to go beyond the idea of like rationalistic decision making. Okay. But here I'm here to speak for the importance of discourse or language. So here's a list of some things that can be, or some methods that can be very useful for these purposes, in addition to, for example, historical case studies. So I think it's important when we talk about strategies and strategizing to then map out the discourse and the vocabularies of. So what are the terms and concepts that we're using? And not only like we, or not only, for example, top management decision makers, you can also and must extend this to like what the media is using, which then triggers other questions as to, are the concepts, are things similar now, or are they different from what was the case, let's say, 20 years ago? Or are the discourses different in Finland from, what they would be or are in other places on the globe? So there are means of doing this. One of the methods which I like a lot is discourse historical analysis, which allows one to look at various discourses and how they are combined. So to use somewhat technical terms, we can talk about interdiscursivity in terms of, let's say, how strategic planning discourse and nationalism meets in contemporary Russian organizations, or, well, I can think of many other examples, but I'm mindful of the time as well here. Or we can do more systematic analysis, which can also involve quantitative, even statistical things, like looking at the textual networks of various vocabularies and see how they might change over time and how they might impact other things. I already mentioned that we are, for example, studying this fantastically interesting case of Espoo. It's interesting because of many things, but it's interesting because they have this Espoo story, and actually that's the picture that I have over here. So many of us, I think, intuitively, I hope, agree that much of developing new strategies and getting people excited is about storytelling. So strategies in many ways are actually narrative structures if we look at their linguistic representation. So there's something that was, is now, and will be in the future, although these narrative components may at times be implicit. And the activity of strategizing or strategic decision-making, hence, is very much about storytelling. Thus, it's important, if we want to understand this aspect of strategic decision-making, to go and study those. How can this be done? Well, case studies of strategic storytelling, but also linguistic analysis of specific narratives and differences in those. And the third thing I want to highlight here is that at the micro level, especially with this frame of mind that maybe strategic decision-making 3.0 is about discursive strategizing, like ongoing rhetorical and discursive struggles and tactics being employed by different actors in different arenas. Well, we need to, I think, and I think this is very, very interesting, to then look at those details. So what can this be? Well, We can, of course, here as well look at like existing corpuses of texts in the media, wherever, but this can also be applied in terms of looking at the internal, for example, meetings of organizations. So we have, for instance, a really cool project with a Finnish broadcasting company, YLE, where we have been following their strategic change processes and been doing video ethnography on their meetings. And what's interesting with this, well, one of the things is that with video, you can, not only capture what is being said in terms of what I say, in terms of verbal or textual things, or what's written on a paper, but also other things like people's reactions, gestures, which allows us to better understand related things such as emotions or affect or the role of sociomateriality, for example, different tools of strategy making. Thus, it can also involve close textual and multimodal analysis. Multimodal means that it can be, for example, visual, as is this case of this cool representation of Espoo's strategy. So I'm mindful of the fact that it's me between you and the reception. So I think I need to wrap up at this point of time. I think we need to study strategic decision making from multiple perspectives, probably in multiple disciplines, using multiple methods. I think that there's a big need to, in this endeavor, use what we can learn from social theory, studies in social sciences, and things developed in the humanities, like linguistics, narrative analysis, as I have pointed out. And I think this can be very useful theoretically, but it can also elucidate aspects that are practically important. So in Aalto spirit, what we of course want to do is to be helpful and to work with companies, with organizations, sometimes in great projects where we can together develop the strategy processes. But I want to finish off with the other side of this, which is that as social scientists, we must also be critical. So it's not only that we're here to help companies to maximize their next quarter profit, but we also have to study things which have this bigger societal relevance, meaning things like, Talvivaara, Fennovoima, you name it. And I think I'll stop here. So thank you.